On paper, I should absolutely adore this smartphone. It has a quality quad DAC backed 3.5mm headphone port, a toolless SIM card slot while retaining IP68 weatherproofing. It has expandable microSD card storage up to 1TB, a proper reliable capacitive fingerprint reader, a notification LED, a 2-stage shutter button, stereo front firing speakers, almost square corners with very thin bezels, the ability to shoot Ultra HD 4K video at 120 FPS, heaps of performance, a big old 5000 mAh battery with wireless charging, a motorized internal zoom camera, a pretty bloat-free skin on Android, and all of this can be yours for under £300 secondhand on eBay. Kinda sounds like a no-brainer, right? Well, it's not entirely that simple, and I want to talk about that today. But before I do, guys, I'm really trying to hit 100,000 subscribers, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button, it really would mean the absolute world to me. Look, there's an awful lot to like about this phone. It's the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV, and though it's a couple of generations old at this point, I think that actually works in its favour as opposed to its detriment. It means it's ridiculous value for money these days, and I know a fair few people who are just after what this phone offers. It includes features that most other phones on the market, almost all the high-end ones, completely omit. You can't find a lot of this in the Galaxy S24 Ultra, the iPhone 16 Pro Max, the Pixel 9 Pro, even my beloved OnePlus 12. It's all pretty scarce these days, and so something like this is one of the very few options with those specific features in mind. Sony phones have quite the cult following online, which based on what I just said probably comes as no surprise. And to be quite honest, I have a hard time disliking the hardware on offer here, even the software to some degree. There's not heaps of bloatware or a clunky skin on top of Android. This phone now runs Android 14, which is pretty sweet, and I think the bubbly stock Android sort of aesthetic works really nicely with the tool screen and the form factor. I couldn't tell you why I find it as satisfying as I do, it just looks great, so tell me in the comments. And the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 with 12GB of RAM, I have to say in this base model is pretty damn rapid and can easily power through anything I do on my phone, which is actually quite a lot of Wikipedia scrolling and mostly social media browsing, but it can also game with very few problems. I've had the big suite of games running on this thing with minor hiccups here and there, but overall a surprisingly pleasant experience at a crazy low price tag. I remember a lot of Sony fanboys at the time screaming that this phone had a 4K display, which isn't strictly true. The largest dimension is 3840, which is the same as the lesser Ultra HD version of 4K, but the shorter resolution is 1644, which is sort of in between Quad HD and Ultra HD. And it doesn't run at that resolution most of the time anyway, which I'm quite frankly happy about for battery life reasons. The display is really nice though. It gets crazy bright, more so than you'd expect from a 2-year-old device, and running at 120Hz, it's a lovely inclusion, it's very smooth. It feels kind of crazy that at this price point you can get such a nice 120Hz OLED. I mean, it's just one of the nicest displays I think you can really get at this sort of money. Alright then, so why, despite all of that stuff and despite having this in my possession, am I not desperate to switch to it from my OnePlus 12? Well, first up, I'm not sold on the software support of this guy. Sony hasn't adapted to many trends, but one that I think it really should have done is to providing 5 or 6 years of software upgrades. This is likely to only get maybe one more software upgrade, taking it to Android 15, which makes the long-term support of it a little iffy. You could load your own ROMs, and I'm sure the hardcore Xperia owners will do that, but it's not for me these days, though the software itself, as it is pretty decent. That said, and I know this is going to sound pretty hypocritical, so bear with me, why is it that the software update experience is so crap? I've had this thing out of the drawer for about a month now leading up to this video, and despite it being on Android 14, it's still asking me to update it, like every time I turn it on. And then there's the camera situation. It's kind of odd, like it has some okay hardware, though nothing groundbreaking here on paper. It has a fairly large 12 megapixel main, smaller 12 megapixel ultra wide, and then a 12 megapixel tele, which is actually an 85 to 125 equivalent motorized zoom. It's kind of strange, kind of gimmicky, and it's all rounded out with a 12 megapixel selfie camera. And the ability to shoot Ultra HD 4K 120p with the rear camera is great, but why is the selfie shooter only limited to Ultra HD 4K 30p? You really couldn't write this. I have just been given this notification for yet another Xperia update. I can't believe that's just happened. Anyway, you get 3 camera apps to choose from. The regular old camera app, which isn't incredibly intuitive from a novice's perspective. The Video Pro app, which adds in some different options and menus, which I guess actually makes a fair amount of sense if you're into video. And then the Cinema Pro app, which feels like a bit of a layout change from Video Pro, and it adds this ultra wide sort of aspect ratio to it. I know you don't have to use all of these, but the software is clunky, and that's coming from a long-term owner of Sony's mirrorless and cinema cameras. The results you get across the board from any of these lenses, the modes, the stills, the moving imagery, whatever you want, they come out kind of mixed. The whole experience feels very muddled and incohesive, and I think that's really quite a shame because I loved the idea of being able to shoot pro video and photo on my phone. But then it's kind of such a hassle to do on this thing, it's not really worth it. And although the iPhones are so much simpler in their operation and more basic, I think they just come out with better results. I don't know, I think you can get some fantastic results with the Sony Xperia, this one in particular actually. It's not that it's bad or that you can get far better from anything else, it's just the process feels very compromised, and there's a lot of noise and mushiness in some of these photos that I just was not expecting. For those like me who do like to shoot manually on a phone sometimes, I found that Video Pro is the one to use, and it's pretty decent. It's so much more coherent than Cinema Pro, I feel like that's just a mess. And then in stills, I just go into the standard camera app, click the basic button, hop into M mode, which does the manual selection, and then from there you can get a fair amount done in this app. It's pretty decent, but again, it's just not that cohesive. Also, the really sweet touch tracking autofocus is limited to 30 FPS, which is kind of frustrating when the camera is able to go to 120. I feel like even at 60 FPS in Ultra HD, it should be able to do that touch tracking, but unfortunately it's not able to do that. James Matthews, a brilliant cinematographer, did an unreal video on how he shot a whole short with this phone, and while the results are spectacular and really show what this camera is capable of, he is an incredibly talented cinematographer, and his knowledge and skill are doing most of the heavy lifting in that video. It's not that anyone can get those results, because he's just a bit unreal. I'm quite annoyed that I don't love this phone. Like, if the software was more cohesive, if the cameras were just straight up better, and if the charging was quicker, I think I'd make the switch, honestly. The display is gorgeous, I love this form factor, the ergonomics, I adore having the 2-stage shutter button on the phone, the headphone port with the quad DAC. I dearly missed the notification LED when I moved away from this phone, and the fact the thing is so cheap as well is just nuts. I absolutely admire Sony for keeping the micro SD slot alive with these things, for those who don't only want to expand our phones but also just have an easier way of transferring files across. And the same goes for the port up top too. As an IM enjoyer, it's great that I can just plug my things into this and not have to worry about bringing a dongle with me. And actually this might be one of the best budget phones for people who want all those features, because the high-end performance, the good battery life, like everything is very solid on this phone. And I think for £300 is basically a no-brainer for someone who wants those features. However, I know that for most people, these things aren't an issue anymore, because most people are rocking Bluetooth buds or a dongle like this gorgeous Kiwi is Allegro, which also gives me a balanced output. And the storage issues that many of us ran into back in the day are sorted by the fact that a lot of phones are like 256, 512, 1TB these days out of the box. And I get that it doesn't really match the whole being able to put an SD card in and upgrade your storage, but I think for the vast majority of people that's just not going to be a problem for them. I should really love the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV, but I don't think I can. It's definitely a good phone for the right person, but that just isn't me.